From Luke chapter 15. I want to read the first two verses to set the context of this story. And then I want to read the story, which is verses 11 through 32. And that's kind of a long reading, and sometimes I urge you not to let your mind drift when there is a long scripture reading. I know that's easy to do when somebody's reading. However, today, this is such a great story. It's certainly one of my favorite stories. I really do not think your mind will drift as you listen to this very famous story that Jesus of Nazareth told. So let's listen to the words of Luke. All the tax collectors and sinners were gathering around Jesus to listen to him. The Pharisees and legal experts were grumbling, saying, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." Jesus said, "A certain man had 2 sons. The younger son said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the inheritance.' Then the father divided his estate between them. Soon afterward, the younger son gathered everything together and took a trip to a land far away. There he wasted his wealth through extravagant living. When he had used up his resources, a severe food shortage across the country arose in that country, and he began to be in need. He hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into the fields to feed pigs. He longed to eat his fill from what the pigs ate, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired hands have more than enough food, but I'm starving to death? I will get up and go to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son. Take me as one of your hired hands.' So he got up and went to his father. While he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was moved with compassion. His father ran to him, hugged him, and kissed him. Then his son said, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quickly, bring out the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Fetch the fatted calf and slaughter it. We must celebrate with feasting, because this son of mine was dead and has come back to life. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now the older son was in the field. Coming in from the field, he approached the house and heard music and dancing. He called one of the servants and asked what was going on. The servant replied, 'Your brother has arrived, and your father has slaughtered the fatted calf because he received his son back safe and sound.' Then the older son was furious and didn't want to enter in. But his father came out and begged him. He answered his father, 'Look, I've served you all these years, and I have never disobeyed your instruction. Yet you've never given me as much as even a young goat so that I can celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours returned after gobbling up your estate on prostitutes, you slaughtered the fattened calf for him.' Then the father said, 'Son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead, and he's alive. He was lost and is found.'" Some people have called this the greatest short story that has ever been written. Now, I don't know. That's quite a statement. And I guess that's a subjective statement as to what one person likes as to another person. But I will say from a personal standpoint that to me, this is one of my favorite stories from Jesus. And no matter how many times I read this story or preach on this story, I always enjoy it. I started out by reading the first 2 verses of chapter 15 of Luke. And as I mentioned, I did that to set the context. So let's go back and look at these 2 verses and see what's going on. Luke tells us in the opening verses of the chapter that Jesus had befriended tax collectors and sinners. In other words, Jesus was making friends with the people who were the outsiders, the people who weren't recognized as the good folks. And the Pharisees and the legal experts, in other words, the religious establishment, criticized Jesus for doing this. They said, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. And so then Luke tells us that Jesus told a series of 3 stories to deal with this controversy of him befriending sinners. The first story he told was the story about a shepherd who had 100 sheep, but he lost one of them, and so he left the 99 and went out and found the one lost sheep. And then the second story was the story where Jesus told about a woman who had precious coins in her house, and she lost one of the precious coins. And she turned the house upside down, looked all over the place, until she found that one precious coin. And then the third story that Jesus told is the story that I've read to you. A story of a father who lost his son. His son left home, went away, but then he came back. This story has a lot of symbolism because it relates back to the criticism of these religious teachers. And so we have 3 characters in the story, and each character represents a certain kind of person or a person. First of all, we have the younger son. The younger son represents the sinful people, the people that Jesus was befriending. And then the younger son has an older brother. And the older brother represents the religious establishment that was critical of Jesus making friends with the sinful people. And then you have the father in the story, the third character, and the father represents to us God. So what I want us to do is to look at the 3 characters of the story and see what we can learn from Jesus' words. First character I want us to look at is the son, the younger son. This younger son came to his father and said, "Father, I'm going to leave home, and I want my share of the inheritance because I'm out of here." Well, now, when you think about what the son said to the father, that was a very audacious thing to say. Actually, a very offensive thing to say. That would be an offensive thing in our day and time for a child to come to his parents and say, "Listen, I want my share of the inheritance now because I want to leave home. So whatever you're going to give me that was in your will, just give it to me now." Well, I think any parent would be offended by that kind of a request. But in the ancient world, this is even more insulting because you see, in the ancient world, fathers received a great deal of respect in that patriarchal society. And so for a son to come to his father and say, "Father, give me my share of the inheritance," in the ancient world of Jesus would have the son literally implying, "Dad, I wish you were dead. But since you aren't dead, I want you to give me what you would give me if I was dead," or if you were dead. Now, there's 2 sons, and according to the custom of that time, the elder son would have received a double portion of the inheritance. So if there were 2 sons, what the father would do is he would divide the estate into 3 equal parts. The older son would get 2 parts, and the younger son would get 1 part. So the younger son receives 1/3 of the estate. And in this story, the father gives it to him. And so the son leaves home, goes off to a distant land. And he has a big time. He's partying. He's having fun. And he blows all the money. And then after he blows all the money, there's a famine in the land. And he doesn't have anything, and nobody will help him. We often call this son the prodigal son. The reason we call him the prodigal son is because the word prodigal means wasteful or extravagant. And Jesus said of this young man in verse 13 that he wasted his wealth in extravagant living. So after all the money was gone and the country where he was living in had fallen on hard times, he was destitute. And so he ends up doing what no respectable Jewish young man would ever do. He ends up tending pigs. Now, again, you have to understand the culture. Here in eastern North Carolina, we love pigs, right? I mean, I love pig pickings, and I love sausage, and I love bacon. Matter of fact, I'm one of these individuals that believes that any meal can be improved if you put a bunch of bacon on it, you know? So in eastern North Carolina, we like pigs. But you have to understand that in the Jewish community, pigs are unclean. They are considered filthy. And an Orthodox Jew would never, ever work with the pigs. So you got to understand that's the culture here. So here's this young man working with the pigs. And then Jesus says that he finally came to his senses. The light bulb finally came on. And he said to himself, man, back home, my father's servants have it better than me. I'm going to go back home and say to my father, Father, I'm not worthy anymore to be your son. I just want to come home and just be a servant. I'll just be a slave. And so that's what he did. Now, the second character I want us to look at is the older brother, the eldest son. He's been out working in the field all day, as he always does, hardworking man. And he comes back in to the house, and he hears music and dancing, and all the neighbors are over, and all the family is over, and there's a big party going on, and dancing, and all this kind of stuff. And so he says to the servant that's standing outside of the house, what's going on? And the servant says, well, your brother has come home. And so your dad has killed the fatted calf. And there's a big party to celebrate this homecoming. Well, the older son was furious. And his attitude was like every good child everywhere who thinks that a sibling who is bad is catching a break from mom and dad. It's not fair. That's how he felt. It's not fair. Man, I heard that all the time when my kids were growing up. So he is infuriated at his father, and he refuses to go in to the party. He must have thought to himself, my dad's just too permissive. We need some standards around here. They've killed the fatted calf. My son or my brother's having a steak dinner. Why, he ought to be eating bread and water instead of a steak dinner. He ought to have hand-me-down clothes, not the best robe. He ought to have blisters on his hands from hard work that my dad makes him do, not putting a ring on his finger. My brother ought to be down on his knees begging for mercy, not the guest of honor at a party where there's dancing and music. And so he refuses to go in. Well, third, let's look at the father in the story. And the way I want us to look at the father is to look at the way that he relates to the two sons. Because you can learn a lot about the father by the way he relates to the sons. First of all, let's look at the way that the father relates to the younger boy that left home. When the younger boy came to his father and said, "Father, give me my share of the estate, I'm out of here," he gave it to him. Now, his father knew that that was a bad decision. His father knew that that wasn't going to work out well. But he gave him the freedom of choice. And I think that tells us something about how God relates to us. He gives us the freedom to choose. Even if we choose the wrong way, even if we choose the unhealthy way, God gives us the freedom to choose. So he let the son have the inheritance. And yet I'm sure the father did not want the boy to leave. He wanted him to stay. And I just imagine in my own mind that every day the father must have looked down the road just hoping and praying that he would see his son coming home. And then one day, the unbelievable happened. He looks down the road and he sees him. He sees his son coming home. And he has compassion for his son. And he runs to his son. And he embraces him. And he kisses him. And his son said, "Father, I'm not even worthy anymore to be your son. Just let me come back home as a servant." But the father says, "No, we'll have none of that. You come back as a son. And we're going to have a party, and we're going to celebrate." What is particularly striking about this story, when you put it back in the culture of Jesus' time, is that he tells us that the father ran to the son. You see, in the ancient world, a father would never run to a wayward son. Now, the wayward son might run to the father and get down on his knees and hang his head and beg for mercy. But the father would never, in that patriarchal society, never run to his son. You see, men of wealth and position never ran in public. The patriarch was too dignified to do such a thing. But in this story, Jesus said the father ran to the son. The son came back to be a slave, but the father received him again as a son. Now I want us to look at how the father relates to the older brother. This is interesting as well. The party's going on. The celebration that the young boy has come back home. But the father looks around the room and he doesn't see his other son. And so he goes outside looking for him. The father takes the initiative to look for his son. And the son was angry. But the father tried to reason with his son. You know what he could have said, and probably what a lot of patriarchal fathers would have said back then, is he could have said this. He could have said, "Listen, this is my estate. This is my land. This is my place. And I'll do with it whatever I want to. You have no say-so in the matter. He could have taken a hard line and done that. But that's not what he did. He tried to reason with his son, and he said to him, "Son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. You want something, just ask me." And it's always been that way. And then he tried to appeal to his son's sense of compassion. He said, "Listen," he says, "your brother was lost, but now he's found. He was dead, but now he's alive. Come on in the house. Come on. Come on in. And let us celebrate that your brother has come home." And that's the end of the story. Did the brother ever go in the house or not? Jesus leaves us hanging. And somebody knows the answer. Jesus leaves us hanging in the story. And I'm sure he did that on purpose, so that we could just do a what if. I wonder what happened. Wonder what happened. Do you think the son went in the house, or do you think he stayed outside? Well, it's just a story. You can take it whichever way you want to take it. And so Jesus just leaves us hanging, and that's the end of it. So what are we to make out of this story? What does it mean to us? I think what Jesus is telling us is a story of God's grace. The Father gave these two sons what they needed, not what they deserved. The Father offered grace to the wasteful and irresponsible son. He could have kicked him out, or he could have received him back as a slave, but no, he takes him back as a son. And the Father offered grace to the legalistic and judgmental son. He could have said to him, "Listen, you aren't so perfect. You think you've done everything right? I've got a list of stuff you haven't done right. You aren't a God." But he didn't. He extended mercy and grace even to the judgmental and legalistic son. I think what Jesus is asking us to do in this story is he's asking us to lift our eyes so that we can see as the Father sees. And so we can treat people as the Father treats people. And all of God's people said, Amen. Amen.